In the vast pantheon of Sith Lords who have cast their shadow across the galaxy, few names evoke as much mystery and intrigue as Darth Plagueis. Often remembered simply as a tale told by Palpatine to seduce Anakin Skywalker to the dark side, the truth about this enigmatic figure runs far deeper than most realize. Darth Plagueis was born a moon, one of those tall, gaunt beings you might recognize from banking centers across the galaxy. With their elongated heads, sunken eyes, and thin lips, moons aren't exactly what you'd picture when thinking of fearsome Sith Lords. They're known more for financial genius than force mastery, but perhaps that unlikely background made Plagueis all the more dangerous. Imagine a being with the natural calculating intellect of a master banker combined with the ruthless ambition of a Sith. That was Plagueis. Born on the crystal world of Mygeeto, he grew up surrounded by wealth and commerce. While other species might see credits as a means to pleasure or security, moons like Plagueis understood money as pure power. And power, as any Sith knows, is the ultimate currency. But how does a member of a species known for running the intergalactic banking clan become one of the most feared practitioners of the dark side? That transformation began under the tutelage of another Sith master, Darth Tenebrous. Think about what Sith training must entail. It's not just lightsaber forms and force techniques. It's psychological breaking and rebuilding. It's learning to channel pain into power. It's embracing fear and hatred as tools rather than emotions to overcome. Under Tenebrous, the moon who would become Plagueis endured trials we can only imagine, emerging not just as a student of the dark side, but as someone who would eventually redefine what the dark side could achieve. What made Plagueis truly unique among the Sith was his approach to the Force. While most Sith Lords viewed the Force through a lens of conquest and domination, Plagueis approached it like a scientist dissecting a new discovery. He wanted to understand the Force at its most fundamental level, not just to use it, but to truly know it, to bend its very nature to his will. This scientific mindset led Plagueis down research paths no Sith had fully explored before. He began collecting ancient texts, Sith holocrons, and artifacts that contained forgotten knowledge. His quarters likely resembled a laboratory as much as a Sith sanctuary, filled with equipment for experiments that pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible with the Force. By his side, through many of these experiments, was his protocol droid, 114D. Not your typical protocol unit, this droid served as Plagueis' assistant, record keeper, and sometimes the only witness to breakthroughs that would have terrified even the most hardened Jedi Masters. Where Plagueis went, 114D followed, documenting discoveries that would never see the light of day in any scientific journal. The dark side knowledge Plagueis accumulated was vast and varied. But his obsession, the research that would eventually earn him the title the Wise, centered on life itself. Plagueis became consumed with understanding how the Force created life, sustained it, and ended it. He wanted to master these processes, to control the very fabric of existence. This obsession wasn't purely academic. Like all Sith, Plagueis feared death. But unlike his predecessors who sought to cheat death through ghosts, essence transfer, or other methods, Plagueis wanted to prevent death altogether. He believed that by understanding the midichlorians, the microscopic life forms that connect living beings to the Force, he could unlock the secret to eternal life. Picture a Sith Lord hunched over equipment in a hidden laboratory, not building superweapons or plotting galactic conquest, but trying to coax midi-chlorians into creating life where none existed before. That was Plagueis at the height of his research, bending the very building blocks of existence to his will. What makes this even more astonishing is the timeline of Plagueis's activities. Recent revelations place him as active during the High Republic era, a time when the Jedi Order was at its zenith. While the Jedi were building outposts across the Outer Rim and celebrating their golden age, Plagueis was already working against them from the shadows. This suggests a patience almost unfathomable to most beings. The High Republic era began around 300 BBY, meaning Plagueis was implementing plans that wouldn't come to full fruition until centuries later. Imagine planting seeds you know you'll never live to see bloom. That was the Sith way under the rule of two, and Plagueis embraced it fully. During this time, Plagueis likely operated under his public persona. Many Sith Lords maintained cover identities, allowing them to move through galactic society undetected by the Jedi. For Plagueis, his moon heritage provided the perfect cover. Who would suspect a banking clan executive of being one of the most powerful dark side users in the galaxy? By 132 BBY, Plagueis had taken on an apprentice of his own. This was significant not just as part of the Sith tradition, but because of who this apprentice was. Known only as the Stranger or Chimere, this individual had once been a Jedi. Think about what that means. Not only had Plagueis managed to remain hidden from the Jedi Order, but he had successfully turned one of their own to the dark side. The transition from Jedi to Sith is never easy. It requires breaking lifelong conditioning, embracing emotions the Jedi are taught to suppress, and committing acts that violate every principle of the Jedi Code. For Plagueis to guide someone through this transformation speaks to his deep understanding of both sides of the Force and the psychology of Force users. What kind of training would a former Jedi receive under a Sith like Plagueis? Likely not just combat techniques or displays of raw power. Plagueis would have focused on reshaping his apprentice's entire worldview, teaching them to see the Force not as a guide to be followed, but as a tool to be mastered. He would have encouraged experimentation, questioning, and a willingness to break taboos the Jedi held sacred. This relationship between Plagueis and his former Jedi apprentice exemplifies something central to Sith philosophy. The Sith don't just reject the Jedi way, they actively seek to prove its inferiority. By turning a Jedi, training them in the dark side, and demonstrating greater power than the Jedi could offer, Plagueis wasn't just gaining an ally, he was validating his own path. But the story of this apprentice is just one chapter in Plagueis's long game against the Jedi Order. Throughout the High Republic era and beyond, he moved pieces on the galactic board with consummate skill. Banking regulations, trade disputes, political appointments, all might seem disconnected from the Force. But in the hands of a Sith strategist like Plagueis, they were weapons as deadly as any lightsaber. Think of the Sith Lords sitting in meetings with banking clan executives, appearing to care about profit margins while secretly undermining Republic stability, or funding explorations to find lost Sith artifacts while ostensibly investing in archaeological research. Every action had dual purposes. Every relationship served the grand design. What made Plagueis truly formidable wasn't just his command of the Force or his scientific breakthroughs. It was his patience, his willingness to work within systems while gradually corrupting them from within. The Jedi looked for threats wielding red lightsabers and shooting lightning from their fingertips. They weren't prepared for a threat that came in the form of loan agreements and trade negotiations. This methodical approach allowed Plagueis to operate for decades, possibly centuries, without detection. While other Sith throughout history had attempted grand, dramatic gestures that exposed them to the Jedi, Plagueis understood that true power often works best when unseen. The legacy of Darth Plagueis extends far beyond his lifetime. His research into midi-chlorians and life creation may have had consequences even he couldn't have fully anticipated. Some speculate that his experiments may have created ripples in the Force that led to unexpected Force-sensitive births generations later. The very balance of the Force itself may have been altered by his meddling with its fundamental aspects. As we continue exploring the story of this legendary moon, we'll discover how his machinations eventually led to the downfall of the Republic and the Jedi Order. But perhaps most importantly, we'll see how Darth Plagueis, through his scientific approach to the dark side, came closer than any Sith before him to achieving the ultimate goal: victory over death itself. Plagueis wasn't just another link in the chain of Sith masters and apprentices. He represented a fundamental shift in how the Sith approached their ancient conflict with the Jedi and their relationship with the Force itself. His story is not just about darkness and power, but about innovation and vision that would reshape the galaxy for generations to come. Throughout the history of the Sith, the pursuit of immortality has been something of an obsession. From ancient lords preserving their spirits in tombs and holocrons, to others attempting to transfer their essence between bodies, cheating death has always been the ultimate expression of power over the natural order. But Darth Plagueis approached this age-old quest in a way no Sith before him had dared. While other Sith turned to ancient rituals, arcane spells, and mystical connections to the dark side, Plagueis looked through the lens of science. To him, immortality wasn't some mystical state to be achieved through meditation or dark ceremonies. It was a biological puzzle waiting to be solved. Picture a laboratory hidden away from prying eyes. Inside, a tall moon figure hunches over equipment that would baffle even the most advanced medical droids of the Republic. Specimens float in Bacta tanks. Data streams across multiple screens. This was where Plagueis conducted his most ambitious research, breaking down the very building blocks of life itself. What made his approach revolutionary was his focus on midi-chlorians, those microscopic life forms that connect all living beings to the Force. Where Jedi saw midi-chlorians as a bridge between the physical and spiritual, Plagueis saw them as cellular components that could be isolated, studied, and ultimately controlled. His experiments were as numerous as they were unethical. Test subjects ranged from simple organisms to complex sentient beings. One of his most valuable subjects was actually a Beath Sith Lord named Darth Plagueis, a secret apprentice of his own master, Tenebros. After defeating Venomous in combat, rather than killing him outright, Plagueis kept him in a comatose state for years, repeatedly subjecting him to experiments that pushed the boundaries of life and death. Think about being able to kill someone and then bring them back, not as some shambling corpse or through possession of another body, but true resurrection, cellular regeneration at its most fundamental level. This is what Plagueis achieved with Venomous, though not without limits. Each time he resurrected the Bith, the damage to his organs accumulated until eventually even Plagueis couldn't reverse the cellular breakdown. These experiments covered a vast range of dark side applications: volition, the ability to bend others to your will; telepathy that went beyond simple mind tricks to deep manipulation of thought patterns, healing that could knit together grievous wounds, regeneration of damaged tissues and organs, and most ambitiously, life extension itself. The cornerstone of all this research was Plagueis's growing ability to influence midichlorians directly. Through years of study, he developed techniques to coax these microscopic entities to replicate themselves, effectively increasing their presence in living tissue. The initial attempts often ended in disaster, with uncontrolled growth killing the host as their cells essentially turned against them. But with each failure came new insights, new refinements to his techniques. Plagueis's ultimate goal went beyond merely extending his own life or healing injuries. He sought nothing less than the power to create life from nothing. Consider the ambition required to believe you could replicate what happens naturally through reproduction, but solely through the manipulation of the Force. Plagueis theorized that he could create a zygote through midichlorian manipulation alone, one that would theoretically produce a being with an unprecedented midichlorian count of 20,000 per cell, far surpassing even the most Force-sensitive beings known to the Jedi. According to the Secrets of the Sith, a text attributed to his eventual apprentice Darth Sidious, Plagueis also explored a form of immortality through transference, a Force power that would allow him to transfer his consciousness to another body. While this approach had been attempted by Sith of old, Plagueis saw it not as a last resort, but as another scientific process to be refined and perfected. As his powers grew, so did his confidence. Plagueis began to believe he was approaching the cusp of true immortality. No Sith before him had come so close to breaking the ultimate limitation of mortal existence. The dark side seemed to bend to his will in ways that would have astounded even his former master. With such achievements came a peculiar transformation in Plagueis himself. Having mastered so many aspects of the Force that others deemed impossible, his fears narrowed to a single concern: losing the power he had accumulated. This wasn't the simple fear of death that drives most beings. It was something more specific, more refined. Plagueis didn't fear non-existence. He feared reverting to a state of limitation. This psychological shift reveals something crucial about the Sith mindset. The pursuit of power is never satisfied, never complete. Each new level of mastery only highlights what remains unachieved. For Plagueis, having tasted godlike control over life itself, the thought of returning to mortality became the only thing capable of triggering genuine dread in his cold Mun heart. But this singular focus on his research and power may have blinded him to more immediate dangers. While he manipulated midichlorians and experimented on helpless subjects, political currents were shifting in the galaxy. And closer to home, his own apprentice was watching, learning, and plotting. Plagueis's overconfidence in his scientific achievements may have led him to believe he had transcended the vulnerability that plagued all living beings. He might have viewed himself as beyond the cycle of master and apprentice that had defined the Sith for a millennium, seeing his research as too valuable, too revolutionary to be interrupted by something as mundane as betrayal. This delusion would prove costly. For all his genius in unraveling the mysteries of life, Plagueis failed to recognize a much simpler truth. Power attracts those who would take it, and sometimes the greatest threat isn't found in the grand mysteries of the Force, but in the ambitions of those closest to us. The legacy of Plagueis's research would extend far beyond his own timeline. His discoveries about midichlorian manipulation, his experiments in life creation, his pursuit of biological immortality, All would cast long shadows over galactic events yet to come. Knowledge that dangerous is rarely lost completely, especially when an attentive apprentice has been watching every move, cataloging every breakthrough, and planning how such powers might serve different ambitions. And now, in the story of Darth Plagueis, it is finally time to introduce his infamous apprentice. Every great Sith master eventually selects an apprentice to carry on their knowledge and ambitions. For Darth Plagueis, that choice would alter the course of galactic history in ways even he couldn't fully foresee. Around 65 BBY, Plagueis turned his attention to a young human from Naboo, a man whose potential in the dark side practically radiated for those with the sensitivity to detect it. His name was Sheev Palpatine. At approximately 19 years old, Palpatine possessed raw talent and a natural affinity for the dark side that made him an ideal candidate to become the next link in the Sith chain. When Plagueis bestowed upon him the title of Darth Sidious, he wasn't simply following tradition. He was making a calculated investment in the future of the Sith Order, one that would ultimately pay dividends beyond his wildest expectations. The relationship between a Sith master and apprentice is fundamentally different from that of the Jedi. Where Jedi masters seek to guide and nurture, Sith Lords push and test, constantly challenging their apprentices to grow stronger through conflict and pain. Plagueis was no exception, subjecting Sidious to rigorous training that would have broken lesser beings. Yet what made their partnership unique was the depth of knowledge Plagueis shared with Sidious. The Moon didn't simply train his apprentice in lightsaber combat or basic force techniques. He revealed the full scope of his scientific research, his theories about midi-chlorians, and his experiments in life manipulation. This level of openness was unusual among the Sith, who typically withheld crucial knowledge as insurance against betrayal. Together, the two devoted themselves to dual pursuits, unlocking the secrets of immortality and executing the grand Sith plan to replace the Republic with a new Sith Empire. These weren't separate goals, but intertwined ambitions. What good would it be to rule the galaxy if that rule was limited by mortality? And what use was eternal life if spent hiding in the shadows? Plagueis instructed Sidious in the philosophy that had guided the Sith for a millennium, the Rule of Two. Established by Darth Bane around 1000 BBY, this doctrine held that there should be only two Sith at any time, a master to embody power and an apprentice to crave it. Plagueis explained how this approach had preserved their order while the Jedi grew complacent in their numerical superiority. But Plagueis' interpretation of the Rule of Two had evolved beyond Bane's original vision. He viewed himself as potentially the culmination of this tradition, perhaps even the Sithari, the perfect being of Sith prophecy. In their private conversations, Plagueis suggested to Sidious that they might eventually transcend the cycle of master and apprentice altogether, ruling side by side for eternity once they achieved immortality. This deviation from orthodox Sith teaching revealed Plagueis' growing confidence in his research. He genuinely believed he was approaching a breakthrough that would render the traditional succession of Sith power obsolete. Why maintain a system designed to ensure the Sith's survival across generations if generations themselves became irrelevant? The partnership between Plagueis and Sidious extended beyond philosophical discussions and laboratory work. Plagueis, operating under his public persona, likely as the influential banking clan figure Hago Damask, orchestrated Palpatine's political rise with meticulous care. In 52 BBY, Palpatine was elected as the Senator of Naboo and the rest of the Chomel sector, a position that placed him at the heart of the Republic they sought to undermine. Consider the audacity of their plan. While most beings worry about their next meal or promotion, these two Sith Lords were executing a strategy spanning decades, methodically positioning pieces on the galactic board with the patience of master strategists. Plagueis worked behind the scenes, leveraging his financial connections and influence, while Sidious presented a flawless public facade as a dedicated public servant. Even after Palpatine's election to the Senate, Plagueis continued to mentor his apprentice, helping him refine the political skills that would eventually elevate him to Supreme Chancellor. Their relationship during this period differed markedly from later Sith dynamics. Plagueis treated Sidious more as a partner than a subordinate, especially as their plan gained momentum. This approach stands in stark contrast to how Sidious would later treat his own apprentices. Where Plagueis shared knowledge openly, Sidious would compartmentalize and restrict information. Where Plagueis discussed his vision of two Sith ruling together, Sidious would maintain strict hierarchical control. These differences hint at how each Lord viewed the ultimate purpose of the Sith Order. For Plagueis, the goal appeared to be transcendence, breaking free from the limitations that had constrained the Sith for millennia. His scientific mindset led him to view power as a means to greater discovery. But for Sidious, power itself was the objective, the accumulation and exercise of control for its own sake. This fundamental difference in philosophy would have profound implications for their partnership. As Sidious established himself in the Senate, he began to grasp the full potential of political power combined with mastery of the dark side. The lessons Plagueis had taught him about manipulation and patience found perfect application in the corrupt halls of the Republic. Senators, diplomats, and eventually even Jedi would fall under the influence of the charming, seemingly honest politician from Naboo, never suspecting the darkness that lay beneath his carefully constructed persona. The training Plagueis provided wasn't limited to politics or force techniques. He also instructed Sidious in the ancient lore of the Sith, knowledge preserved through holocrons and texts recovered from forgotten temples and tombs. This education gave Sidious a perspective few beings in the galaxy possessed, an understanding of how the constant struggle between light and dark had shaped civilization itself. Their collaboration approached its peak when Plagueis revealed to Sidious his most ambitious experiment yet. The Moon believed he was on the verge of directly influencing midichlorians to create life, potentially bringing into existence a being of unprecedented force sensitivity. What Plagueis couldn't know was how this revelation would factor into his apprentice's calculations. Throughout their years together, Plagueis had observed Sidious's growth with the pride of a master seeing his work flourish. But he failed to recognize a crucial truth about his apprentice. Sidious had internalized the Sith teachings perhaps too well. The human had embraced completely the idea that the apprentice must eventually overcome the master, not as some distant eventuality, but as an active goal to be achieved at the optimal moment. As Plagueis shared more of his research and power, he unwittingly accelerated this timeline. The more godlike Plagueis became in his abilities, the more urgently Sidious felt the need to claim that power for himself. The very success of their partnership contained the seeds of its destruction, a paradox worthy of Sith philosophy itself. Their relationship exemplified the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the rule of two. The master must train the apprentice to be powerful enough to continue the Sith legacy, but not powerful enough to pose an immediate threat. The apprentice must learn all they can from the master while preparing for the inevitable confrontation. It's a delicate balance that has preserved the Sith for a millennium, but also ensured their existence is defined by betrayal. What made Plagueis vulnerable wasn't a lack of power or foresight, but perhaps an excess of ambition. In his quest to transcend the limitations of mortality, he began to believe he could also transcend the fundamental nature of the Sith relationship. He envisioned a future where he and Sidious would rule together eternally, breaking the cycle that had defined their order for 1,000 years. It was a beautiful vision, but one that failed to account for the human nature of his apprentice. Sidious had not been trained to share power, but to seize it. He had not been molded to cooperate, but to dominate. The very qualities that made him an ideal Sith apprentice made him incapable of embracing Plagueis's revolutionary vision of partnership. As Sidious solidified his position in the Senate and began to form connections with key figures across the galaxy, the dynamics of their relationship shifted subtly. The student was becoming the master in ways Plagueis might have recognized had he not been so focused on his research into immortality. The political web Sidious was weaving complemented the scientific breakthroughs Plagueis was achieving, creating a synergy that accelerated their grand plan. But beneath this productive collaboration, currents of ambition and calculation were flowing in directions Plagueis couldn't fully perceive. The apprentice was evaluating the master, measuring his usefulness, assessing his vulnerabilities, and waiting for the perfect moment to make his move. The story of Plagueis and Sidious reminds us that in the realm of the Sith, even the most powerful can be blind to the danger closest to them. While Plagueis looked to the stars and dreamed of eternal life, his greatest threat was sitting across from him, absorbing his knowledge, adapting his techniques, and planning for a future where there would be no need for a master anymore. To fully grasp the relationship between Plagueis and Sidious, we need to take a step back and examine the philosophy that governed the Sith Order for a millennium. The rule of two wasn't just a tradition or a suggestion. It was the fundamental principle that reshaped the Sith after their near extinction. Around 1000 BBY, in the aftermath of the devastating Jedi-Sith War, the Sith Order lay in ruins, their numbers decimated, their power fractured, and their future uncertain. From these ashes rose a visionary Sith Lord named Darth Bane, who looked at the destruction of his order and saw not just failure, but opportunity. Bane recognized something his fellow Sith had missed. Their greatest weakness wasn't the Jedi, but themselves. The old Sith Empire had been plagued by constant infighting, backstabbing, and power struggles. Lesser Sith formed alliances against stronger ones. Apprentices conspired prematurely against masters. The dark side itself seemed to foster this self-destructive behavior. So Bane made a radical decision. He eliminated the remaining Sith Lords and decreed that henceforth there would be only two Sith at any given time, a master and an apprentice. This wasn't just a practical measure to avoid detection by the Jedi. It was a philosophical revolution that addressed the fundamental nature of the dark side itself. The dark side of the Force thrives on passion, ambition, and the will to power. These qualities, while sources of strength, also naturally lead to conflict when too many Sith gather. By limiting their number to 2, Bane channeled these destructive tendencies into a constructive framework. In crafting this new doctrine, Bane drew inspiration from an ancient Force concept, the dyad. A Force dyad occurs when 2 Force-sensitive beings share an unbreakable bond, becoming essentially one in the Force while remaining 2 separate individuals. While the rule of 2 doesn't create such a literal connection, it mimics the dyad structure of 2 beings united in purpose, yet distinct in role. Under the rule of 2, the Master's duty was to accumulate knowledge and power, then pass it on to a worthy apprentice. The apprentice's duty was to learn everything the Master had to teach, then, when the moment was right, to destroy the Master and take their place. This brutal succession ensured that each generation of Sith would be stronger than the last, as only those who could surpass their masters would survive to continue the line. Think about what this means in practice. Unlike the Jedi, who sought to support and elevate their Padawans, Sith Masters faced a constant dilemma. They needed to train their apprentices to be powerful enough to continue the Sith legacy, but not so powerful that they posed an immediate threat. Meanwhile, apprentices had to learn all they could while hiding their growing strength until they were ready to challenge their master. This created a relationship defined by calculation, suspicion, and inevitable betrayal. Master and apprentice might work together for decades, might even develop a form of respect or attachment, but both always knew how their relationship was destined to end. The rule of 2 transformed betrayal from a moral failing into a sacred duty, a necessary step in the evolution of their order. The genius of Bane's system was that it aligned the natural Sith tendencies toward ambition and domination with the long-term interests of their order. Each Sith knew their role and the price of failure. Masters who grew complacent or weak would be replaced. Apprentices who moved against their masters too soon would be destroyed. The system was self-regulating, ensuring that only the strongest, most cunning Sith would advance their lineage. The philosophy of constant testing and refinement extended beyond just lightsaber combat or Force techniques. It applied to every aspect of Sith training: strategic thinking, political maneuvering, manipulation of others, technological innovation, and the deep mysteries of the dark side itself. Each generation was expected not just to preserve the knowledge of their predecessors, but to expand upon it. The rule of 2 also solved another problem that had plagued the old Sith Empire: secrecy. With only 2 Sith in existence, they could operate from the shadows, influencing events without revealing themselves to the Jedi. The cloak of secrecy became one of their greatest weapons, allowing them to work toward the downfall of the Republic and the Jedi Order over centuries, while their enemies remained oblivious to the threat. For 1,000 years, this philosophy guided the Sith, producing a lineage of increasingly powerful dark side users. From Bane to his apprentice Zana, through generations of masters and apprentices whose names have been lost to history, the torch of Sith knowledge was passed down, growing brighter with each succession. The Jedi, meanwhile, believed the Sith had been extinct since the end of the war, allowing the Dark Lords to plot their revenge undisturbed. By the time the mantle passed to Plagueis, the rule of 2 had proven its effectiveness beyond even Bane's expectations. The Sith had not only survived, but thrived. accumulating power and influence, while the Jedi grew complacent in their perceived victory. The stage was set for the culmination of the grand plan, the destruction of the Jedi, and the rise of a Sith Empire. But every system, no matter how well designed, contains the seeds of its own transformation. The rule of two created masters of escalating power and ambition, individuals who might eventually question even the foundations of their order. Plagueis, with his scientific mind and breakthrough research into immortality, began to wonder if the time had come to move beyond Bane's doctrine. If death itself could be conquered, what need would there be for the master-apprentice succession? If two Sith could live forever, constantly growing in power and knowledge, couldn't they achieve more than an endless cycle of training and betrayal? These questions likely occupied Plagueis' thoughts as he trained Sidious and shared with him the secrets of midi-chlorian manipulation. What Plagueis failed to appreciate fully was how deeply the rule of two had shaped Sidious's thinking. His apprentice had internalized not just the letter of Bane's law, but its spirit. Sidious understood that the rule of two wasn't merely about limiting numbers or ensuring secrecy. It was about the constant refinement of Sith power through conflict and succession. To break that cycle would be to risk stagnation, something the ambitious senator from Naboo could never accept. The tension between Plagueis' evolutionary thinking and Sidious' orthodox interpretation of Sith philosophy created an unstable dynamic in their partnership. While they worked together toward common goals, their divergent visions of the Sith future placed them on a collision course that neither fully recognized until it was too late. In many ways, the relationship between Plagueis and Sidious represents the rule of two in its most refined form. Two supremely intelligent, powerful Sith Lords, each bringing unique strengths to their partnership, yet bound by a philosophy that demanded their cooperation be temporary. Their story demonstrates both the strengths and the limitations of Bane's system, the way it drove the Sith to new heights of power, while ensuring that the path to that power would be paved with betrayal. As we continue exploring the story of Darth Plagueis, keep in mind this fundamental tension at the heart of the Sith Order. Every action, every decision, every shared secret between master and apprentice exists within the framework of the rule of two, where today's ally is tomorrow's obstacle on the path to greater power. While the rule of two provided the Sith with a functional framework for survival and growth, Darth Plagueis came to view it as merely a stepping stone to something far more potent. During his extensive research into ancient Force knowledge, Plagueis made a discovery that would obsess him for years to come: the doctrine of the dyad. This wasn't just another piece of forgotten lore. It was the revelation of what had inspired Darth Bane's rule of two in the first place. The doctrine of the dyad centered on a rare and extraordinary Force phenomenon, a connection between two Force users so powerful and fundamental that they essentially became one entity in the Force while remaining physically separate. Unlike the rule of two, which was a deliberately created philosophy, the Force dyad wasn't something that could simply be established through intention or ritual. It was a natural occurrence, something that happened when the Force itself bound two individuals together. The bond transcended normal Force connections, creating a power nexus that was, in the ancient texts Plagueis studied, described as strong as life itself. For a Sith Lord already obsessed with controlling and extending life, this description must have been irresistible. Here was a potential pathway to the immortality he sought, not through midi-chlorian manipulation alone, but through a connection that might transcend individual mortality. If two beings could become one in the Force, might that oneness continue even if one physical form perished? The parallels to his scientific research would have been obvious to someone with Plagueis's analytical mind. In standard reproduction, genetic material from two sources combines to create something new that carries elements of both. Perhaps a Force dyad represented a similar principle operating on a metaphysical level, the combining of two Force signatures to create something greater than either individual could achieve alone. Armed with this knowledge and driven by his characteristic ambition, Plagueis attempted something that no Sith Lord before him had dared: to forge a Force dyad with his apprentice, Sidious. It was an audacious goal, one that would have fundamentally altered the nature of their relationship and potentially the future of the Sith Order itself. Think about what this tells us about Plagueis as a Sith Master. Where other Sith Lords maintained careful distance from their apprentices, always mindful of the inevitable betrayal the rule of two demanded, Plagueis sought to create the most intimate connection possible with Sidious. It speaks to his confidence in his own power, but also to a certain naivety about his apprentice's true nature. The process of attempting to create this dyad likely involved esoteric rituals and Force techniques lost to time. We know from Sidious's own writings in The Secrets of the Sith that these attempts took place, though details of the specific methods remain obscure. What is clear is that despite Plagueis's knowledge and power, the efforts failed completely. As Sidious himself later noted, though he was wise in the ways of the Force, he proved unworthy of the task. This dismissive assessment reveals not just the outcome of the attempt, but Sidious's contempt for what he perceived as his master's failure. It's worth considering whether Sidious actively resisted the formation of the dyad, recognizing that such a bond might give Plagueis too much influence over him. The failure to establish a Force dyad represents a crucial turning point in the relationship between Plagueis and Sidious. For Plagueis, it was a rare setback in his otherwise steady progress toward mastering the secrets of the Force. It suggested there were still some aspects of the Force that remained beyond his control, limits to what even his scientific approach could achieve. For Sidious, the failed attempt likely reinforced his growing belief that his master, for all his knowledge, was ultimately reaching beyond his grasp. Sidious came to view the rule of two itself as a pale imitation of the doctrine of the dyad, a compromise born of necessity rather than the ultimate expression of Sith philosophy its creators had intended. This perspective shaped Sidious's own approach as a Sith master. Where Plagueis had sought connection with his apprentice, Sidious would maintain strict hierarchy and distance. Where Plagueis had shared knowledge openly, Sidious would parcel out information strategically, keeping crucial secrets to himself. And where Plagueis had envisioned two Sith ruling side by side, Sidious would insist on absolute authority. What makes the search for the dyad particularly fascinating is how it ties into broader themes in the Star Wars saga. Generations later, a true Force dyad would naturally form between Rey and Ben Solo, demonstrating that what Plagueis had sought through manipulation and control could only come about through the will of the Force itself. The dyad, it seems, requires both light and dark elements to manifest, something the purely dark side approach of the Sith could never achieve. The distinction between the rule of two and the doctrine of the dyad reveals something essential about the limitations of Sith philosophy. The Sith sought to bend the Force to their will, to control, rather than commune with it. Yet the most powerful force phenomena, like the dyad, emerge not from domination, but from balance and harmony, concepts fundamentally at odds with Sith teaching. Plagueis's inability to recognize this fundamental truth speaks to his greatest blind spot. For all his scientific brilliance and Force mastery, he remained constrained by the Sith worldview, unable to see that some aspects of the Force cannot be seized through ambition or intellect alone. They must be allowed to manifest naturally through surrender rather than control. This failure may have planted the seeds of doubt in Plagueis's mind about the ultimate viability of the Sith path as it had been practiced for a millennium. If the dyad represented a power greater than what the rule of two could achieve, and yet remained beyond his grasp despite all his knowledge and effort, what did that suggest about the foundations of Sith philosophy itself? Such questions would have troubled a mind as analytical as Plagueis's. Perhaps in response, he doubled down on his scientific research, seeking through midi-chlorian manipulation what he could not achieve through the dyad. If he couldn't create a metaphysical bond with his apprentice that transcended death, he would find another path to immortality. Meanwhile, Sidious observed his master's frustration and failure with calculating eyes. He absorbed the lesson that some powers remain beyond even the most knowledgeable Sith, filing this information away for future use. Unlike Plagueis, Sidious did not allow failed experiments to shake his faith in the Sith way. Instead, he incorporated each new piece of knowledge into his growing arsenal, discarding what didn't work and refining what did. The aftermath of the failed dyad attempt accelerated the evolution of their partnership. Plagueis, perhaps sensing his apprentice's growing ambition, began to emphasize more strongly their potential to rule together, trying to redirect Sidious's inevitable desire for advancement toward a shared goal rather than the traditional Sith succession. Sidious, in turn, presented the perfect image of the devoted apprentice while inwardly calculating when and how to make his move. What we see in this chapter of the Plagueis-Sidious relationship is the fundamental irony of their partnership. The more Plagueis sought to transcend traditional Sith limitations, the more firmly Sidious embraced them. The Master looked forward to a new era beyond the rule of two, while the apprentice perfected his understanding of Bane's doctrine. Neither fully understood the other's true intentions until it was too late. The search for the dyad, ultimately unsuccessful, nonetheless reveals volumes about both Sith Lords. It shows Plagueis's willingness to explore beyond established boundaries, his scientific curiosity, and his growing doubts about traditional Sith methods. For Sidious, it demonstrates his ability to learn from his master's failures, as well as his successes, and his recognition that some powers, no matter how desirable, might remain beyond reach. As their partnership continued to develop, this failed experiment would remain a silent but significant factor in their evolving dynamic. Plagueis would continue seeking alternative paths to immortality, while Sidious would file away the knowledge of the dyad, recognizing its theoretical power but accepting its practical inaccessibility. Both would move forward, master and apprentice, united in purpose but increasingly divided in vision, approaching the climactic moment when their divergent paths would finally and fatally separate. The partnership between Darth Plagueis and Darth Sidious had been productive beyond what either could have achieved alone. Together, they had advanced Sith knowledge, particularly in the realm of midi-chlorian manipulation, and positioned themselves strategically within galactic politics. Sidious had risen to prominence in the Senate, while Plagueis operated from the shadows, likely using his influence in banking and finance to further their shared agenda. But the rule of two contains within it an inevitable conclusion. The apprentice must eventually challenge the master. This isn't just tradition or custom, it's the very mechanism by which the Sith ensure their evolution. For all his brilliance, for all his attempts to transcend Sith limitations, Plagueis remained blind to the most basic truth of the order he served. Apprentices are meant to surpass their masters. As Sidious absorbed more and more of Plagueis's knowledge, a shift began to occur in their dynamic. The Moon Sith Lord, consumed by his research into immortality and life creation, grew increasingly focused on the laboratory rather than the political arena. Meanwhile, Sidious was honing his skills in manipulation, deception, and the accumulation of political power. Two different paths toward the same ultimate goal: control. There came a point when Sidious realized he had learned everything of value that his master could teach him. The scientific principles behind midi-chlorian manipulation, the ancient Sith rituals, the subtle applications of Force techniques for manipulation and control, all had been mastered by the ambitious apprentice. More critically, Sidious had begun to see his master's flaws. Where Plagueis saw scientific discovery as an end in itself, Sidious recognized it only as a means to power. Where Plagueis dreamed of eternal life shared between two Sith Lords, Sidious envisioned himself as the sole eternal emperor of the galaxy. The philosophical gap between them had grown too wide to bridge. Plagueis had become, in Sidious' cold assessment, a distraction. The master spent his time on experiments and research, while the real work of undermining the Republic and the Jedi progressed through Sidious political maneuvering. What use was a partner who had retreated into theoretical pursuits when the practical application of Sith power was finally within reach? The decision, when it came, was likely made with the same calculating precision Sidious brought to all his endeavors. In accordance with the rule of two tradition that Plagueis himself had taught him, Sidious determined that the time had come to claim the title of Master for himself. The actual moment of betrayal was remarkably straightforward for such a momentous event in Sith history. Sidious simply broke into his master's apartment while Plagueis slept. No dramatic lightsaber duel, no thundering confrontation of Force powers, not even a final exchange of philosophies or accusations. The man who would become emperor struck while his victim was completely vulnerable. This method of assassination speaks volumes about Sidious' character. He didn't need the validation of defeating his master in open combat. He had no interest in proving his superior skill or power. Sidious cared only for results, for efficiency, for the cold reality of succession. Plagueis had outlived his usefulness, so Plagueis had to die. It was that simple. The exact method of Plagueis's murder remains somewhat obscure in official records. Some accounts suggest Force lightning, others imply a more direct attack. What matters is the result: the death of one of the most knowledgeable and powerful Sith Lords in the Order's history, not in glorious battle, but in his sleep. The irony of Plagueis's death cannot be overstated. Here was a Sith Lord who had devoted his life to conquering death itself, who may have even believed he had achieved a form of immortality through his midi-chlorian research, struck down in the most mundane way possible. All his knowledge, all his power, all his scientific breakthroughs rendered meaningless in a moment of vulnerability. As Sidious would later note, Plagueis simply did not act fast enough to prevent his own demise. The master who could manipulate life at its most fundamental level failed to sense the danger from his own apprentice until it was too late. Perhaps his confidence in their partnership blinded him to the reality of Sith relationships. Perhaps his focus on scientific pursuits dulled his awareness of more immediate threats. Or perhaps he simply underestimated just how completely Sidious had embraced the traditional Sith path. In the aftermath of the murder, Sidious assumed not just the title of Sith Master, but also full control of their grand plan. The vision of two Sith ruling side by side for eternity died with Plagueis. In its place emerged Sidious' more orthodox approach, one master, supreme and unchallenged, with apprentices who served only until they were no longer useful. The death of Plagueis served as a formative lesson for Sidious, one that would shape his approach to power for decades to come. He regarded his master's trust in him as a critical mistake, a weakness he vowed never to repeat. Where Plagueis had shared knowledge openly, Sidious would keep secrets from his own apprentices. Where Plagueis had dreamed of partnership, Sidious would insist on dominance. Where Plagueis had let down his guard, Sidious would remain ever vigilant. This perspective explains much about Sidious' later behavior with his own apprentices, particularly Darth Vader. He never treated Vader as a true partner, never shared all his knowledge, never allowed any relationship to develop that might threaten his absolute authority. The memory of how easily he had disposed of his own trusting master served as a constant reminder of the dangers of complacency. With Plagueis gone and his position as Sith Master secured, Sidious moved forward with their plan to destroy the Jedi and seize control of the Republic. But he did so on his terms, with modifications to reflect his singular vision. The scientific research into midi-chlorian manipulation and immortality continued, but now as just one component of a broader strategy centered on political power rather than force mastery. One question that has fascinated scholars of Sith history is whether Plagueis truly died that night. Given his advanced research into immortality and the preservation of consciousness, some have speculated that he might have found a way to survive in some form. Could his consciousness have persisted, perhaps seeking to influence galactic events from beyond physical death? While such theories are intriguing, no concrete evidence has emerged to support them. By all accounts, Sidious' assassination was successful and complete. Plagueis, for all his knowledge of life and death, appeared to have succumbed to the same mortality that claims all living beings. The ultimate limitation he sought to overcome ultimately claimed him, as it has claimed nearly all who have sought to cheat it. The true legacy of Plagueis lies not in some continued existence, but in the knowledge and techniques he developed, which lived on through his apprentice. Sidious would go on to apply and extend Plagueis' research, especially in his own quest for immortality. The experiments in midi-chlorian manipulation, the studies of life creation, the exploration of consciousness transfer, all continued under Sidious' direction, though perhaps with less scientific rigor and more pragmatic focus on applicable results. In the years following Plagueis' death, as Sidious orchestrated the Clone Wars, executed Order 66, and established the Galactic Empire, he occasionally reflected on his former master, not with regret or nostalgia, but with the cold assessment of a Sith Lord evaluating the past for lessons applicable to the present. Plagueis had been brilliant but flawed, powerful but vulnerable, visionary but blind to the threat right beside him. The story of Darth Plagueis ended not with a grand confrontation or a heroic last stand, but with the quiet efficiency of Sith pragmatism. The apprentice had surpassed the master, as the rule of two demanded. The cycle had continued, with the stronger replacing the weaker. The Sith Order had evolved once more, shedding what no longer served it and embracing a new, more focused direction under its new master. And yet, in the quiet moments after his triumph, as Sidious stood over the body of his former master, he might have felt something unexpected, not satisfaction or pride, but a moment of genuine respect. Plagueis had been a worthy teacher, a brilliant mind, and a true Sith Lord. His death was necessary for the evolution of the Sith, but that didn't diminish his contributions to their cause. In that moment of respect, if it indeed occurred, we see the complexity of Sith relationships. Beyond the betrayal and ambition lies a recognition of shared purpose, of belonging to something greater than themselves. The rule of two ensures conflict between master and apprentice, but it also binds them together in a lineage stretching back 1,000 years, each link in the chain essential to the strength of the whole. Plagueis's physical form might have died that night, but his knowledge, his discoveries, and his vision lived on through Sidious. In this way, perhaps he achieved a form of immortality after all, not through midi-chlorian manipulation or consciousness transfer, but through the much older, much simpler method of passing knowledge from one generation to the next. Not the godlike eternal existence he sought, but the more humble immortality of influence and legacy. When you strip away all the power, all the knowledge, all the grand schemes, what remains of Darth Plagueis? A brilliant mind who came so close to breaking the final barrier between life and death. A Sith Lord who tried to rewrite the rules that had governed his order for a millennium. A scientist who saw the Force not as something mystical to be revered, but as something physical to be manipulated. And in the end, a corpse, murdered in his sleep by the very apprentice he had trained and trusted. His research lived on. His discoveries changed the course of galactic history. Through Sidious, through Vader, through the fall of the Republic and the rise and fall of the Empire, the fingerprints of Plagueis can be found everywhere. Even in the final confrontation between Rey and a resurrected Sidious, the shadow of the long-dead Moon Sith Lord loomed large. But perhaps the question we should ask ourselves isn't what Plagueis discovered or how he died. Perhaps the real question is this. In his relentless pursuit of eternal life, did Darth Plagueis ever truly live?